Errol Spence vs Terence Crawford generated 700,000 pay-per-view sales. KSI vs Tommy Fury generated 1.3 million. So the big question we're left with is, has influencer boxing taken over real boxing? It seems that especially over the last couple of years, this has turned into something very serious that looks like there's a huge demand for, and it won't be stopping anytime soon. In boxing, anything over 500,000 pay-per-view buys is labelled a mega fight, and to see that every single KSI or Logan Paul / Jake Paul fight has massively exceeded this number and even topping some of the biggest fights of the decade is insane. And let's not forget, the fights we're comparing them to aren't small fights at all. In fact, they're possibly once a decade, maybe once a generation type fights, like the long awaited super fight between Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, which was a mega fight for the #1 pound for pound spot and for all the welterweight world titles. Or even the Ryan Garcia and Gervonta Davis fight that was hyped up for years and was an absolutely huge event, but still pulled in 1.2 million pay-per-view sales, which means it was a crazy big event, but it was still 100,000 less than the recent KSI vs Tommy Fury fight that pulled in 1.3 million. To me, it's still insane that YouTubers are entering a world that's not even theirs and put on events that are topping the world's best. But how did we get here? Well, let's rewind back to 2018 when this all started. This all started with a fight between KSI and Joe Weller having some personal beef, and this was supposed to be a one-off fight. YouTubers had never done anything like this, and this was going to be a one-off event that did top numbers, but once KSI won, he eventually led to calling out Logan Paul or Jake Paul. This led to a fight between KSI and Logan Paul, which was huge. It broke records, do 1.5 million pay-per-view sales, and even the rematch between them had, according to Eddie Hearn, 2 million, but we don't know how true that is. That was according to his sources, but if that's true, that would make the second fight in the top 10 pay-per-view events in combat sports of all time. And let's not forget what Jake Paul's done. The eyes he's brought to the sport with so many of his fights doing over 1 million pay-per-view buys, it's fair to say he's carried a big proportion of YouTube boxing scene, with huge fights like Ben Askren, Nate Robinson, and fighting all these UFC stars. And it's because guys like him and KSI have become so invested in the sport of boxing that it raises so many questions and curiosities that make people so invested in their careers to see how good they can really be, because let's face it, it's nothing we've ever seen before. Some of these fights are so ridiculous it makes you want to watch it. Take Floyd Mayweather versus Logan Paul for example. That fight was insanity, but it was definitely interesting and had people wanting to watch it. But where are all these new eyes coming from? Well, let's be honest. When we look at the fan base of these big YouTubers, it's mostly kids. Obviously kids are going to watch these guys on YouTube, and when their favorite YouTubers boxing, they're going to be interested. And these younger audiences who have never watched boxing before are going to be the majority of these pay-per-view buyers. Usual boxing fans over the last decade have generally been an older target audience. These influencers have such a big social media presence which allows them to promote themselves, in which the biggest way of marketing is today, through social media. I mean, that is literally their job, so of course they're going to be well experienced in selling a fight through social media, which we have seen. Not just that, but there's just something special about YouTuber boxing events compared to regular boxing events. The level of entertainment just feels like a bit more in the influencer scene, and it's through things that maybe the regular boxing scene wouldn't be able to do, as it may ruin the reputation of the sport. So they have to keep everything standard. Whereas since YouTubers boxing is already crazy as it is, there's no limit to how far they can go. We've seen tag team boxing, 4 people fighting in a free-for-all, and yes, this is absolutely ridiculous, but it brings attention. Whether or not it's good or bad attention, it's still additional sales. If you remember the Jake Paul vs Ben Askren fight on Triller, that show went to crap and was all over the place, but it was entertaining the whole way through. They got in Justin Bieber performing, Snoop Dogg hosting, Oscar De La Hoya coked up.
What's the prediction?
I don't care who it is. I don't care who it is. I will fight till the end. I will bleed till the end, and I will go down till the end.
All right, let's look at our tail of the tape for our next.
A big Jake Paul robot walking around everywhere. The biggest TikTok stars in the world in attendance and in the ring putting the belts on people. It's so extra, but it's what makes it so different, and it just goes above and beyond the regular boxing event. But it's not just the influencers themselves who are responsible for making this so big. Unfortunately, it's the real boxing scene. In the decade 2010 to 2020, it had to be one of the most boring decades for boxing, with not too many young stars and the biggest pay-per-view stars being in their 30s and towards the end of their careers. And huge pay-per-view events happen only once every few years. For example, Manny Pacquiao vs Floyd Mayweather was dubbed to be one of the biggest fights of the century. It took so many years to get made, and unfortunately didn't really live up to the hype. then leaving people having to wait God knows how many years for another big event like this. Whereas with influencer boxing, we see these huge fights get made all the time and even a couple times a year. All of these fights have been made within the last 3 years. So even as a boxer myself, I'll admit, the influencer boxing scene can be a lot more interesting than real boxing at times. And yes, we have seen some good fights this year in 2023, but before this, we barely had anything as boxing fans due to modern day boxing, unfortunately, where fights don't get made for various reasons. So what's the future of influencer boxing? And what's the effect of it on the sport of boxing? In my opinion, it could have some real detrimental effects on the sport of boxing. And yes, YouTuber fights definitely do bring a new audience to real boxing, but the problem lies when these influencer fights start to overshadow real talent, like KSI vs Logan Paul 2. Devin Haney was on the undercard of that fight. It can also cause the sport of boxing to be viewed as an entertainment show and not as a real skilled sport that is appreciated by the people. Due to the success of influencer boxing, it may become the image of boxing and overshadow the real skilled boxers at a professional level. With the success of this, promoters may be likely to invest their resources into this, as this is where the money is, instead of investing it into real young talent to become great and pay-per-view stars in the boxing world. But what do you guys think? Is this good for the sport, or is it bad for the sport? And do you believe that influencer boxing will become even bigger over the next few years? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you smash that subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss an upload from us. That'll be all. We'll catch you in the next one.